Perfect. So I guess this you already know. So let's skip over this slide, and I come back to who the hell am I to talk about sales growth, startups, and so on. So I started my career as a robotics engineer a long, long time ago. I call it my past life now. Worked with European Space Agency, developing interplanetary rovers. So really geeky stuff. Somehow got into consulting Volkswagen and Rolls-Royce for their lean R&D or lean product development, because that was a new thing there. Lean manufacturing was there, but lean R&D, lean product development was a really new thing. So we have to design and completely new processes. Somehow got into doing PhD at EPFL in product market fit and international expansion. Got drunk one night with some friends. We had a bet, and which turned into a startup. And eventually that startup kind of took off. We started to have employees and few big customers and so on and so forth. Couldn't do PhD and a startup at the same time. Had a big fight with my professor. Eventually he became our angel investor. And I quit my PhD at the end of second year. And that was the start of my startup journey. And over a decade and a half, I went on to start several more startups. Some of them failed after a few million ARR, and some of them grew to a couple of hundred employees. And that also completely changed my profile from being an engineer to a sales and growth person, because I have to become one. Because that was the common element between all the startups that succeeded and all the startups that failed, that we couldn't sell, right? So before we go on further, this is an InnoSwiss presentation officially, and I'm an InnoSwiss coach. Quick word about InnoSwiss. So they do a lot of things, especially for startup. There is this InnoSwiss coaching program, which you enter at the initial phase and you end after the scale-up phase, obviously. But then each phase also has a certain amount of budget allocated for you that you can use to get coaching and help and whatever you need. Anything from legal to marketing to copywriting, whatever. There are a wide variety of coaches available in InnoSwiss database, and you have access to all of them. Of course, there is also a process of having a lead coach, which guides you through the process from beginning to the end. But each of these three tracks, basically one after the other, and once you have a bit of a business model, you start to get traction, you go to the core coaching. When you start to have a bit of a pipeline, then you go to the scale-up coaching, in a nutshell. Of course, there are more details to it. One of the questions for any of these kind of programs, when I'm a founder myself, always ask, like, is it even worth spending time into forming the application, figure things out, and accept it, and then what's my chances of getting accepted anyway? So here in InnoSwiss, we have a very high acceptance rate. It drops, at least from 2021 data, it drops at the core coaching, because many ideas fither away in initial coaching when we try to find the business model and the first customer and so on and so forth. But then most of them, once they get into core coaching, they also find it easier to scale, right? So in a nutshell, this is InnoSwiss coaching is all about. So before we start, can I get a quick hands-on vote? Like, how many of us are super early stage pre-revenue startups? Okay, how many are 5 to or 10 to 50 or customer kind of range startup? Okay, and how many of us have no startup and no intention of starting a startup? Okay, so.
No intention, I think you got it. It's hard to say.
But there is an intention, right? We're still questioning it, but there is an intention. That's all it matters. So are there some people who are like already in the scale-up phase, several hundred million ARR? Okay, perfect. So let me start with, we talk about scientific sales processes and how do we implement science and so on, so we can get more repeatable, predictable results in terms of sales. So let me start with, what the hell is scientific approach anyway? So let's imagine one day you wake up and you realize you don't have your phone next to your bed, which you usually put. In your mind, you suddenly start hypothesizing, right? So you say, oh, it could be in my pen that I wore yesterday. So that was your hypothesis. You did a test because you went to the fence, check, pocket, you find it, and you conclude your hypothesis was correct. But while you're doing that, you're not only doing that, you're also starting to create further hypothesis. Oh, is it in the bathroom? Is it in the bar I went last night? Did I left it there? And while you're doing that, you're also prioritizing which hypothesis to test first based on what is easiest to test and what is more likely to result in an outcome. That is, in a nutshell, a scientific process, which means as humans, we are very intuitive about scientific processes, but at the same time, we're not. We're going to come to that. But what does it entails? Like, what is the benefit of scientific process anyway? Is to create accurate and reliable results. Accurate means we want to hit 9, we hit 9. We want to hit 10, we hit 10. Reliable means, well, we want to hit 9, but we hit 5 every single time. And accurate and reliable obviously means we hit 9 or 10 every single time what we actually want to hit. So in a nutshell, scientific process is not only create repeatable success, guaranteed success, but it also is one of the fastest way we know to produce results beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, coming back to our intuition about scientific process, like we do that when there is a simple question, single variable problems. But the minute those questions and problems becomes multivariable and complex, our intuition takes over and our mind is start to become lazy. And that is why over centuries we have developed as humans processes which we now call philosophy of science to deal with complex situation, still get accurate and predictable and reliable answers without a reasonable doubt time and time again. A startup is not very different from any scientific endeavor. It's a series of hypotheses, and we're moving towards something, achieving, answering questions, basically. So in a nutshell, again, it's problem, hypothesis, test, analyze, and conclusion. But the biggest trick is in finding, or rather, the artistic part of scientific process is nailing down the question. What is the problem, and how to take a multivariable, complex problem, break it down into small pieces, and then do lab tests. The whole definition of a lab test is eliminate as many variables as possible so we can answer one question at a time. Then we answer 2 variables, then we answer 3 variables, and so on and so forth. And this is also something, any of you have done PhD or spent time with PhD students, the first year is whole dedicated is about defining the problem and how creative can you be about the hypothesis of the results you can get, how we can test those hypotheses. And then, of course, the rest of them comes with time. So at the end of the day, scientific process we build up to solve complex problems, and it also helps us speed up the process because we can define the problems in smaller chunks, prioritize them, solve one thing at a time, change directions as we need to see fit. So it's also become the fastest way to get to the result. Now, while science is about finding answers to questions, engineering is about using those answers to create solutions or products while still using scientific methods. So we can still keep on getting products that are reliable and accurate and predictable. One of the achievement of 20th century in engineering is assembly line. That is the milestone, or that's the benchmark in predictability, reliability, and systematization and scaling. And that is also not very far away on what the sales process typically looks like. So what I now want to move in the direction is, can we learn something from the assembly line engineers and create our sales processes in a way so they are scalable from day one? Because any company who is doing any kind of manufacturing in an assembly line, doesn't matter if their market today is 10 products a year or 100 million products a year, assembly line by definition are scalable. And you can break it down in small pieces. You have very clear input, you have very clear output. You can always take them apart and say, okay, this one step in the assembly line is something one I want to improve today, or this is what is creating the threshold limits. Let's optimize that phase without affecting the rest of the assembly line. And we can continuously and keep doing that, whether it's about automation, optimization, or improvements. So, as I said, the assembly lines are by definition scalable. We can do it. Once we build an assembly line, whether it's for sales or manufacturing, we can always duplicate an assembly line. We can just make 2 of them. Doesn't matter how inefficient they are, doesn't matter how slow they are, but we cannot do that with handicraft people. We cannot just set up 2 assembly lines. We cannot train and onboard at the speed assembly line worker who is only focused on one step in an assembly line, like we can do with a handicraft or an artisan. We can modify it with time, like I said. We can put together different pieces. We can focus on one step at a time. But we can also run parallel assembly lines for different products, whether it's, again, for sales or manufacturing. And then we can also do mix and match with the assembly line. We realize we're developing 2 products, but the first 3 steps are the same. Then we split into 2, then it combines at the end, maybe. From sales perspective, just like an engineer would design an assembly line needs an input from the product designer, like, hey, you need to tell me what kind of raw material we can get, what is the output, what kind of volume we're looking at, what kind of cost we can afford right now. The same thing if we are designing an assembly line. These are primary, obviously there are more details to it, but these are primary 6 things we really need to nail down. So, to build an assembly line, we have 6 questions, more or less, that we need to find answer like a scientist. Then we have to use that answers like an engineer to create a sales assembly line, which becomes scalable and predictable pretty much from day 1. So obviously, the output is customer, input is who are we selling to, what problem are we solving, how do we measure success for the customer, target volume. So what's our next milestone? Are we talking about next milestone should be 1,000 customers or 200 customers, in what timeline? Buyer's journey is stakeholders. That basically defines the steps we have to go through in a sales assembly line, what should be the primary steps. Work at each step is basically we're talking at each sales step. So that's message market fit. And then cost, price, profit, right? So we need to start with something, then we improve, and as we can invest more. So given all of that, obviously there is a lot in designing a sales assembly line, but I will point out 3 most common issues I see from a founder who is designing a product. Like if we take the manufacturing assembly line example, designing a product and then designing the instructions for the assembly line engineers, or designing an assembly line from there. The 3 things, when we took at the sales side, the 3 are the most common things. But then it's also a bit of a ping pong, because you see, if you don't know assembly lines exist and you're designing a product to manufacture, you will design a product very different way than if you know it will be on a manufacturing assembly line. So you will design and document your product in a very different way. So that's the ping pong here. There is rapid prototyping, but is it designed for manufacturing? Then you have to change the design, change the components many times, simplify a lot of things, right? So, but the 3 most common things are aiming for the right stage. So what I mean by that is, typically, somebody would have 5 customers and say, okay, what's your next sales goal? Either it's undefined or it's 1,000 customers. And I'm like, yeah, maybe we should chop it down a little bit so that we can start building assembly lines for a shorter and shorter period and focus more on improvement than designing something that is, it's like you have today, Tesla has 5 customers and suddenly they want to set up Gigafactory. No, there were a couple of intermediary steps in between. Mostly the way to design, like what's the next goal, is always comes down to what is the minimum threshold I need to achieve that will change the status of my company, or that will answer a very critical question about the company or de-risk the company. So if you have 10 customers, I think we can safe to say the problem you're solving exists that people want to pay for. Once you get to 50 customers, you as a founder can execute. You just didn't get lucky. For first 10 customers, yeah, you might have got just lucky, but maybe you won't be execute, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing about if you do not, if you take two massive goals and don't chop it down, it's very hard to build or even start putting components together for sales assembly lines. Then the second thing is, apart from the bigger goals, there is another way to still think about bigger steps, which is bigger market sizes. Yes, okay, we need to have a bigger addressable market size, but at the same time, it's very hard to get those 6 components if our market size is 10 billion. To take an example, because that also comes down to, ultimately, in any scientific process, we take the population, we take a sample size of that population that, whatever with mathematical magic, can have a representative sample size. And then we can test things on sample size without actually even selling, just talking, experimenting, and so on and so forth, to get those 6 answers. Once we get those 6 answers, we can start selling. I mean, before, but we can start building an assembly line. But if, so let's say, I have a chocolate, and I don't know how many people are going to like it on the planet, but my population size is, 8 billion. Well, let's say 10% is a representative sample. That's still a very huge amount. So we need to chop it down. At the same time, we need to start sales today. So I can chop it down many different ways. But then, let's say, I come up with, my first segment priority is children between 8 to 10 in the city of Zurich. Now, 10% of that, I can get taste testing done in a day. I can be very certainly sure that children between 8 and 10 will like or dislike my chocolate. So assuming they like my chocolate, I can start building an assembly line for 8 to 10. Then I can do another experiment in parallel for 10 to 12. And then I modify my assembly line for 8 to 12, or I create 2 assembly lines based on how much is the gap between what the variables we found while testing. So this is kind of in a nutshell what I mean. The third thing is prioritize one layer at a time. Yes, we need 6 answers, but at the same time, we try to, so the third thing which I commonly see is, we don't have leads, but let's optimize our demo anyway. I'm like, yes, but you need to have a demo or some idea of how it's going to go, but we don't need to optimize it today. First, we need to optimize our niche. Who are we targeting? Then we have to make sure that we're targeting the right person who's going to buy today, not 6 months from now. Then we have to figure out what kind of messaging will resonate for the first step of the assembly line, so they can be at least on the assembly line. And then how do we get from there to the demo and build the rest of it? So sometimes it's also, even as a assembly line designer, even if you have all the variables, first of all you don't, but even if you have them, you just don't design the assembly line in one time. You start with 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, 4 step. That's how you design any product for that matter. So that's pretty much it. Thinking in terms of assembly line and sales assembly line is try to get the startup to in a more predictable sales from early on. And if we can do that, well, predictable sales is kind of important for scaling anyway. And once we have that, we can work on 1 step at a time to increase reliability, increase performance, increase efficiency by automation, individual steps, rather than trying to automate the whole sales process. And in the process, we can also reduce the price. The QR code is for my LinkedIn, just in case if somebody want to connect. I have been accused of not giving enough examples in past. So I'm hoping we can converse. You can ask me some questions so I can give some examples in the context rather than something very generic. Shall we? Please. completely bypassing the marketing? Not at all. Not at all. How do you generate leads? So for me, sales and marketing is one assembly line. So when we say raw material, now we can split like sales assembly line and marketing assembly line. But from the company perspective, it's just one ramp, which means the raw material doesn't have to be lead. It could be a list. It could be a persona. It could be targeting on LinkedIn. So it could be anything. And then there is one single ramp. Yes, there are handoffs and so on and so forth, but those are details of your own design. So I'm not ignoring marketing at all. Yes, in the image, what I found, it says leads. It doesn't say personas, and it becomes very complicated on the slide to say that. But yes, I'm not ignoring marketing. It's one single ramp.
We're a small startup at the moment in B2B enterprise sales. I think we've been quite successful in validating interest, but it's a big difference to demand. So do you have some examples of how companies validate demand, actually willingness to sign large contracts? If sales cycles are typically like 6 to 12 months, how do you run?
So the only difference between when the sales cycles are shorter and longer is the time it takes to gather all the variables, right? If the sales cycles are longer, but at the same time, there are fundamental variables you can get pretty much upfront, like who exactly are the kind of enterprise customer who will buy from us today versus the enterprise customers who will say, come back to us when you're a little bit more mature or you have more features and whatnot. So who is more desperate, in a manner of speaking? Who is your early adopter? We can do that. We can figure out who exactly would be the decision maker ultimately, who's going to say yes. There's going to be a lot of stakeholders who can say no, but then none of them can say yes. But we need to figure out who can say yes. We can do that early on without actually making any sale. We can figure out how that person thinks, what is his perceived problem that he is willing to pay for. How does it matches with our product? What can we deliver today, and does he agree with our plan? Not for growth, but like product plan and the feature or value delivery plan. We don't need to make a sale for that. We can know all of these upfront. No?
Yeah, I think there's still quite a big step then in a large enterprise, right? So from basically those tests to actually knowing that you get through the full process. I was just wondering if you have
Yes.
examples from like other startups that you coach, like how did they do statistical scientific tests if the sample size in the end is quite small, right? Because you need to only make, say, 5 sales in a year, for example.
That actually simplifies your problem, because then there is no sample size. You can sample the whole population. Right? You can just have initial conversation with the whole population, and what they say is absolute truth. So I can give more examples. We can talk about it in more details, one-to-one, outside. But
I have a bit of similar questions. We're in hardware B2B sales, and currently we're working closely with 5 clients, and we see like now we start like understanding the commonalities they have, but as well we still see like some of those have differences, and like our industry is quite condensed, but we don't have so many like clients we could test hypotheses on basically. So would you rather and work with those 5 clients and like intensivate these discussions with the risk that they might be biased, as well like the discussions might be biased, or would you then try to do like you want to test multiple hypotheses, like swapping your audience you're testing with?
For people who are not your customers yet. That's what you mean, right? So there are always 2 approaches when we're talking about ICP and growing. One approach is saying, okay, we have a set of customers. We think there are at least 50, 100 more lookalikes should be there. So the question is not how do we test the hypothesis. Question is how do I map these 5 customers so much in detail that I can build an assembly line just from the data, and then the only question is, how do I find their lookalikes? That's one approach. The second approach is obviously to look outwards and say, okay, we have completely new ideas, completely new products or lines or whatever, which may or may not be suitable for our existing customer. So we are now looking for a new market segment. Then we are obviously doing the chocolate taste testing in a manner of speaking with defining segments and identifying those. But generally, I would suggest that if there is a possibility to find lookalikes, that's a faster way to achieve the next threshold in most of the startups.
And how do you, for example, like one of the specific questions we have is like whether we should sell or lease our equipment or rent out our equipment, which is like completely different revenue models. And the industry is so well connected, like if we apply it on one sample of the industry, we can be pretty sure that it can be spread all around the industry. And like, if I want to test the hypothesis, I'm like, this is our model because this is then how you basically test it.
Okay, so this will require a bit more one-to-one because now we're talking about defining the problem itself. What are we testing?
Yeah.
What is the question? What is the real question, and how we can split it into small pieces, and then we can have hypothesis of it. Then we can have some tests. So let's talk one-to-one after this.
Perhaps some tips, especially when you want as a startup to move into the big corporate. I see there always the problem that the startups don't really get to the people that they should talk to, and then the sales cycles are so long. We have some best case example that said, okay, do it like that.
Right. The way I think about it is like sales cycles have two major milestones. So one major milestone is obviously when the contract is signed, and the second milestone is when the person who actually can say yes to you, you see a shine in his eyes, to say, okay, this is interesting. I need to get on this. And in my experience, which is again very biased and small, most of the founders who are not sales pros try to get to the contract while skipping the step in the middle. So they go all around the person. So they contact all the people who are easy to get on phone, then working hard to get on phone first with the right guy so they can see the light in his eyes. And if they don't, well, they shouldn't be talking to other stakeholders because that doesn't make any sense. Because if he says yes, even theoretically and verbally, like this is interesting, if this does what you say, we're definitely on it. This is relevant for us. Then the people who can say no, they have to justify their no, not to you, but to him. So that is one tip, if you will, is that get to that person. It might be hard, but then, an analogy would be like somebody is looking for a coin below a lamppost, and he say, hey, I dropped my penny, that's why I'm looking. And you say, why are you looking here? Did you drop it here? No, I look it there. I dropped it there, but it's dark there. So I'm looking for here. So that's kind of one pattern I see many times that we're not, it's because it's hard to reach out to somebody. It's just, yeah. Does this answer your, okay. So for the rest of you, was it like super clear, or was it like complete blur and I have no idea what the hell did you talked about in the last 20 minutes? What was the case? Super clear? Wow, okay, one vote.
Maybe one more question. It goes in the direction of Thierry's question. In my experience, sometimes it's hard to get in contact, in a personal contact, remote or physical, to the company, to the sales target. So
Yeah.
do you have any kind of best practices or data, considering B2B, software as a service and sales, how to get in contact with at least the gatekeeper, or even better, the deciding person? So
Look, gatekeepers are easy to contact. They're just hard to pass by, but they are standing at the gate, so you can always go to the gate. That's the whole definition of gatekeeper, right? But yeah, So the two things to it. One thing is, if I'm super early stage, I can build my pipeline saying like a master student would. I'm not selling you anything. I'm doing this thesis project where I have to interview CMOs of Fortune 500 consumer brands. Whoever I interview is in my pipeline now, right? But then I can also interview them to get exactly the answer of these 6 questions, and in the next meeting, I say them exactly what they said to me. And if they say no, then I'm like, ooh, it doesn't make any sense. I need a clarification now because you said this is what you want, and now you're saying you don't want this. What did I miss out? Right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, there are always more things you can do to get in touch with somebody than email and LinkedIn. There are always more things to do. So for example, if I'm super rich, let's say, I can send a Ferrari gift to you, and with a note saying, I need 15 minutes of your time. Would you call me back? You would. Doesn't matter who you are. Even Elon Musk will call me back, right? Or if I'm super poor, I can stand in your parking lot 6 a.m. in the morning. Yes, the guard is gonna shout at you, and when you're gonna come, you will give me 15 minutes when the guard tells you he's standing from 6 a.m. So these are two extremes, but there are a lot of middle ground where there is a lot of scope to think creatively sometimes beyond email and LinkedIn to get that 15 minutes. So somebody didn't get anything, like it doesn't make sense at all. The whole process, presentation, point, so to say. I'm trying to improve it for the next time, not trying to blame you.
Maybe I see like one limitation with the idea of building assembly lines for different departments. Like just thinking about it, because it quickly can create these silos you don't want to have in companies. But you said before you think about marketing and sales as one assembly line, like how do you make sure that at the end, when you scale, you still have an understanding of the company's one bigger value creation, not small individual assembly lines?
Fair enough. Are you an engineer? Just want to use the right analogy to.
So not too technical, please. No.
Yeah. So, for example, whenever we build any systems, or let's say we are designing a website, right? Designing a website has 2 components. That is a single ramp of the user journey. He's going to do this. He's going to click here. Then he's going to do that. The form. Then the form have to work. But then you also have different departments or people collaborating on designing a website. Somebody has to design the messaging, somebody has to design the button, somebody has to design the form and connect to the backend. So the question becomes, what is that one single ramp for your startup? And then so there is one single ramp where the customer is going through from purely sales, and which is the most important thing for a startup, for any company point of view. But then every other department is either on that ramp, like marketing and sales, or it's perpendicular to that ramp that needs to provide certain input at certain points. And those could also be time critical. So there is assembly line which is perpendicular to the primary assembly line. And that's how you burn down the silos. Because you don't want every part to interact with everybody, but at the same time, the right part should interact with the right step in the right assembly line. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it's very valuable because it's a startup sickness not to think in process and this clarity because everything's new and we should try and be creative. So I think it's good to give it this kind of thinking.
The worst thing that can happen to a startup is that something worked, but we can't replicate it anymore. We cannot do more of it. We cannot scale it. It's just something worked, and we have no idea why did it work and how we can repeat it. And this is the kind of mindset at the end of the day that says, okay, let's be intentional about what we are experimenting. Yes, we should do a lot of experimentation, but let's be a bit more intentional about, because just in case it works, we want to double down on this right now. If it doesn't work, well, it doesn't work. But at least then also there is a whole learning component of when things doesn't work. If you're not systematic or cognizant about it, then you don't learn. You just say, well, I did email campaigns and it doesn't work. But no, email campaigns work. It just doesn't work for you. So that means there is some component might be missing here. All right. No more questions? And nobody who didn't understand anything. Okay. All right, thank you.